I was 34 years old when I discovered the truth. My wife, Jessica, had been hiding for 8 months. A truth so calculated, so strategic, that the world's most sophisticated spy couldn't have planned it better. But the moment of discovery wasn't in some shadowy office or through a cryptic email. It happened in the most opulent, high-security penthouse suite in Chicago, where I had traveled 1,500 miles just to give her a kiss. My name is David Hayes, and for 12 years I believed I was living a solid, respectable, if sometimes boring, middle-class life with my corporate consultant wife, Jessica. She was flying to Chicago for what she called a critical 5-day corporate conference. We had been distant, sure, but I missed her. I wanted to reignite the spark. I wanted to remind her of the man who loved her. So I spent a significant portion of my bonus, money I'd saved for a down payment on a new car, to book a last-minute flight, arrange a private car, and buy a ridiculously expensive bottle of champagne. The plan was simple. Arrive unannounced, sweep her off her feet, and spend one romantic night together before flying back. The perfect surprise. I remember the excitement buzzing in my chest as the cab pulled up to the Peninsula Hotel. This wasn't the kind of place my company, or even Jessica's usual clients booked. This was a place for kings, or maybe the people who owned the kings. When I checked in, the concierge didn't even blink. They simply confirmed that Mrs. Hayes was registered and directed me, almost reverently, to the penthouse level. The penthouse level. That was the first prickle of unease. Jessica always stayed in standard business suites. The opulence of the marble lobby and the hushed tones of the staff already felt wrong, like I was walking into a world I didn't belong in. I took the private elevator up. The silence was deafening, the carpet too plush. When the doors opened, I found myself on a floor that housed only 2 enormous suites. Hers was 54A. I smoothed my jacket, took a deep breath, and pulled out the key card I'd sweet-talked the front desk into giving me, claiming I'd forgotten my duplicate in the car. My heart wasn't racing with anticipation anymore. It was pounding with a sudden icy dread. I stood outside the heavy wooden door, the bottle of champagne clutched in my hand, ready to insert the card. But before I could, I hesitated. Through the thick door, I could hear muffled sounds. Not the sound of someone working late on a presentation. It was laughter. Deep, unfamiliar male laughter, followed by Jessica's distinctive, breathy giggle, a sound she hadn't made for me in years. The romantic gesture evaporated. All that was left was the key card, the cold marble floor beneath my feet, and the sickening realization that my surprise was about to become the biggest mistake of my life. I inserted the key card. The green light blinked. I pushed the door open just enough to slip inside without announcement, hoping to catch her by surprise. The suite was breathtaking, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire Chicago skyline. But my eyes didn't register the view. They registered the scene unfolding in the center of the living area. Jessica was there, yes, but she wasn't alone. She was draped across a massive leather sofa, intimately involved with a man who was clearly not just a colleague. He was older, impeccably dressed, even in his relaxed state, and radiated the kind of effortless power that only comes with obscene wealth. I froze, the champagne bottle slipping slightly in my sweaty grasp. I was about to yell, to shatter the silence with 12 years of wounded pride, when my brain, thankfully, slammed the emotional brakes. The man turned his head slightly, and the blood drained from my face. It wasn't just some wealthy client. It was Alexander Thorne, the Alexander Thorne, the notorious tech trillionaire whose face graced every financial magazine and whose net worth exceeded the GDP of several small countries. In that instant, everything shifted. This wasn't a drunken mistake after a conference happy hour. This was calculated. This was a partnership of power and finance that dwarfed my simple life. Confronting them now would accomplish nothing but public humiliation and a swift legal takedown by Thorne's army of lawyers. I realized the danger and the sheer scale of the deception. My initial heartbroken instinct to scream was replaced by a cold, surgical focus. Survive. Document. I silently retreated, pulling the door almost shut, careful not to make a sound. My marketing training kicked in. Data is power. I needed proof. I needed context. I needed to understand what this meant. I secured myself in a small, recessed service stairwell just around the corner, where the staff usually waited for elevator service, and pulled out my backpack. The irony was brutal. I had brought a tiny, high-quality audio-video recorder, a gift I planned to give Jessica, claiming it was for her important client meetings. I had tested it before the trip, and it was ridiculously discreet.
Now it was my only weapon. My hands were shaking, but my mind was utterly clear. I knew I couldn't risk going back in yet, but I needed something immediate. I positioned the small device near the floor, right by the suite's entrance, utilizing the gap between the door and the frame to capture audio from the living area. I needed to know what they were discussing. I needed to know if this was just sex, or if it was business. I stood there, pressed against the cold concrete of the service stairwell, listening to the static and the faint sounds filtering through the door. It was sickening, but the identification of Thorn had given me a strange kind of armor. I wasn't just a betrayed husband anymore. I was a man who had stumbled upon a conspiracy.
That moment when you know something's off but can't prove it yet, when the scale of the deception is so huge you can barely comprehend it, that's when you need to act strategically. If you've been there, or if you want to see how deep this conspiracy went, hit that subscribe button, because what I discovered next changed everything, not just about my marriage, but about my entire future. I stayed in that stairwell for another hour, long enough to capture several minutes of their casual, intimate conversation. I heard Jessica mention her 5-year plan and Thorn laugh, saying, "You're always so focused, darling. That's what I love about you." 5 years. We had been married for 12. What 5-year plan was she referring to? The vague, unsettling comments only solidified my decision. I needed to leave the penthouse floor, but I absolutely could not leave Chicago.
I had to stay and gather irrefutable proof. I slipped out of the hotel as quietly as I had arrived, the expensive champagne bottle still in my backpack, now feeling like a lead weight. I checked into a cheap motel 6 blocks away, a world away from the peninsula. The contrast was jarring, from trillionaire luxury to stained carpets and buzzing fluorescent lights. This was my base of operations for the next 48 hours. The clock was ticking. Jessica thought she was safe in her bubble of wealth and secrecy. I was about to burst it. My first task was reviewing the audio I'd captured. The quality was better than I expected. It wasn't just the intimate sounds that confirmed the affair. It was the casual, possessive way Thorn spoke to her, and the way Jessica responded, detailing her travel schedule and making excuses for why she couldn't extend her stay. Excuses that clearly referenced me, her unsuspecting husband, back home. "David thinks I have that corporate retreat next month," she'd said, and Thorn had simply grunted in response. I spent the rest of that night and the entire next day returning to the peninsula, utilizing my knowledge of hotel services and maintenance schedules. I realized the flower arrangement near the suite door was changed daily. I managed to discreetly place the recording device inside the thick foliage of the arrangement on the second day, disguised perfectly. This gave me continuous, high-quality audio and even some visual access to the main living area when the door was open. The recordings over the next 36 hours confirmed my worst fears.
This wasn't a fling. This was a long-term, calculated relationship. They discussed investments, corporate strategy, and most chillingly, the timeline for Jessica's exit strategy from her current life. I had to maintain absolute emotional control. Every time I heard her voice, light and happy with him, I felt a physical wrench in my gut. But I had to compartmentalize. David the husband was heartbroken. David the investigator was focused on the evidence chain. I needed to prove this wasn't just adultery, it was financial opportunism. I was operating on pure adrenaline and black coffee, documenting every time I entered the hotel, every receipt, every moment of captured audio. I was building a case, not just for divorce, but for fraud. The initial, irrefutable audio-visual proof of the affair was secured, and that was phase 1.
Most people would have exploded right there, standing outside that door, ready to ruin the moment. If you respect the strategic approach of documenting first before reacting, tap that like button.
This wasn't about revenge. It was about self-preservation. I knew the affair evidence alone would secure a fault divorce, but I needed the financial documentation to truly protect myself from the premeditated scheme I suspected. I needed to know what the 5-year plan was. I had to get inside the suite when they weren't there. My chance came late on the second afternoon. Thorne had a private jet scheduled for London, and Jessica was seeing him off at a nearby airfield before returning to the penthouse to pack up for the conference. I knew I had about 90 minutes. It was the riskiest move, but I had to take it. I used the duplicate keycard again, my heart hammering against my ribs, and slipped inside. The suite was silent, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and Jessica's perfume. I went straight for her things. She was meticulous, but also arrogant in her security. She had a small, expensive corporate tablet she used exclusively for her private consulting work. I found it on the bedside table. She had a simple 4-digit PIN, our anniversary date. I typed it in. It worked. What I found on that tablet didn't just break my heart, it incinerated 12 years of memory. It was a folder labeled Exit Strategy. Inside, there were detailed spreadsheets, legal notes, and email chains with an attorney named Marcus.
The documents laid out her plan to file for divorce after our upcoming 5-year anniversary of moving to North Carolina, which was known for its stringent alimony laws based on the length of marriage and economic disparity. She had been charting my career earnings, calculating the maximum alimony she could demand, and detailing the division of assets under our prenuptial agreement. The key discovery was an email thread dated 8 months prior, the exact time she started taking these critical conferences, where she discussed with her lawyer how evidence of my infidelity would strengthen her claim, even though she was the one having the affair. She was planning to leverage her affair with Thorne to secure her future, using me as the compliant, financially stable stepping stone. The marriage wasn't love. It was a calculated financial scheme nearing its payoff point. I didn't cry.
I didn't rage. I felt a cold, clean determination wash over me. I meticulously photographed every page, every spreadsheet, every damning email using my phone. I captured the date stamps, the attorney's contact information, and the detailed financial projections. I had gone from being a betrayed husband to the victim of premeditated fraud. This evidence changed the nature of the investigation entirely. It wasn't about being angry. It was about protecting myself from a professional predator. I reset her tablet, placed it back exactly where I found it, and slipped out of the peninsula, this time carrying not just recordings of her betrayal, but the blueprint of her destruction. That moment when everything clicks into place and you realize the truth, that the person you loved was actively planning to ruin you. Drop a comment if you've experienced that awful clarity.
Because knowing the why is often more painful than the what. I flew home that same night, not waiting for Jessica's return. I carried the evidence package like a shield. I knew I had less than a week before she came back and initiated her plan. I couldn't risk confrontation. I needed legal firepower immediately to execute a counter-strategy. The moment I landed, I contacted the best family law attorney I could find in the state, Patricia Morrison. She specialized in financial fraud and complex, high-stakes divorces. Her reputation was granted. I scheduled an emergency meeting for 8 a.m. the next morning. Walking into Patricia Morrison's office felt like stepping onto solid ground after months on a sinking ship. She was sharp, concise, and utterly devoid of emotion. Exactly what I needed. I laid out the evidence.
The recordings of Jessica and Thorne, the hotel receipts proving the luxury accommodations, and, most importantly, the meticulous photographs of the exit strategy documents detailing the 5-year mark and the alimony maximization scheme. Morrison reviewed the evidence package for nearly an hour, occasionally nodding, her pen tapping lightly against her desk. "Mr. Hayes," she finally said, "this is not just adultery. This is strong evidence of premeditated financial opportunism and marital misconduct. In North Carolina, this gives us the legal standing to file for divorce based on fault, which severely limits, if not completely eliminates, her ability to claim alimony, regardless of your prenup." We developed a detailed counterplan immediately. The key was surprise and speed.
We had to file first, securing the narrative and ensuring I retained control over joint liquid assets before she could move them. The plan involved securing my 401k, changing passwords on our joint investment accounts, and preparing the divorce petition with the evidence affidavit attached. We set the timeline. The papers would be filed and served within 7 days of Jessica's return. The hardest part was the waiting. Jessica returned home 2 days later, refreshed, tanned, and seemingly oblivious. I had to maintain the loving, unsuspecting husband persona. I asked her about the conference, and she gave vague, rehearsed answers about synergy and market disruption. I smiled, cooked her favorite meal, and even asked about her flight, all while knowing I had the blueprint of her betrayal stored securely in a safe deposit box.
The cognitive dissonance was excruciating, but I held fast to the strategy. I was no longer David the victim. I was David the strategist, executing a precise professional maneuver. If you want more deep dive stories about people who turn the tables on betrayal using strategy and documentation, the membership gives you access to content that goes even further, including the specifics of the legal strategy we employed. The tension during those 7 days was unbearable. Jessica acted smug, confident that she was in control. She complained about the quality of the hotel coffee and the long hours, completely unaware that I had been inside her penthouse suite and downloaded her entire life plan. Under Morrison's guidance, I executed all the necessary financial maneuvering, the strategic method. My 401k was secured, my personal accounts were locked down, and the final divorce petition along with the irrefutable evidence package was ready for filing. We decided the moment of execution had to be public enough to prevent denial, yet controlled enough to ensure she couldn't escape the legal service. Morrison scheduled the filing for 11 a.m. on a Friday, just before a major corporate presentation Jessica was scheduled to give to a potential client, a presentation she'd been bragging about for weeks. The reputational damage would be immediate and maximal. Jessica was completely focused on her presentation. She was dressed in a sharp power suit, reviewing notes in the dining room. She even had the audacity to complain about a stain on the tablecloth, highlighting her complete disconnect from reality. "I need everything perfect, David," she snapped. "This deal is critical."
"I understand, Jess," I said calmly, pouring myself a glass of water. I looked at the clock. 10:55 a.m. The service agents were already in position outside her office building downtown. I walked over to the dining room table, standing opposite her. I looked her directly in the eye, and for the first time in a week, I let the mask slip just a fraction. "You know, Jess," I said, my voice steady, "I thought you were in Chicago for a conference. A 5-day corporate conference." She barely glanced up. "I was, David. Long days, short nights." "Why?" "I know, Jess. I know exactly how long your nights were. And I know exactly who you were spending them with. Alexander Thorne, wasn't it? The trillionaire?" Her head snapped up. Her face went from confident consultant to sheer terror in a split second. "David, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous." "Is it, Jess? Is it ridiculous? I know about the Peninsula penthouse. I know about the long-term affair. And I know about the 5-year plan." I paused, letting the words sink in, watching the color drain from her face as she realized the extent of my knowledge. I've penned something in the first comment that might help if you're navigating a difficult relationship situation. It's about being prepared for moments like this. The doorbell rang precisely at 11:05 a.m. It wasn't the sound of an Amazon delivery. It was the sound of destiny. Jessica stared at me, paralyzed. "Who is that?" "That, Jess," I said, stepping back, "is your lawyer, or rather the legal representative of my lawyer." She watched, horrified, as 2 process servers, led by a stern-looking man in a suit, stepped into our living room. They didn't speak to me. They walked straight up to Jessica, who was still frozen at the dining table.
Jessica Hayes, the lead server stated formally. You have been served with a petition for dissolution of marriage on the grounds of marital misconduct and an affidavit of evidence detailing premeditated financial fraud. They dropped the thick stack of documents onto the expensive tablecloth, right next to her presentation notes. The top page of the affidavit was a high-resolution photograph I had taken, the spreadsheet detailing the 5-year mark and the projected alimony maximization. Jessica picked up the documents with trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the photographs, the dates, the notes from her lawyer. When she saw the photo of the tablet screen, the realization hit her. I hadn't just guessed about Thorne. I knew her entire scheme. "You won't get away with this, David. My lawyer," she stammered, scrambling to find her phone.
Your lawyer is now dealing with Patricia Morrison. I cut in, maintaining a calm, controlled demeanor. And Miss Morrison has been provided with the audio recordings from the peninsula, the photos of your financial plan, and the receipts that prove you were leveraging your affair with Thorne to maximize your financial gain against me. This is not a no-fault divorce, Jess. This is fault, and you planned it for years. I didn't wait for her hysterical response. I had delivered the statement I'd rehearsed 100 times. I had exposed the fraud. My job was done. I simply turned and walked out the front door, leaving her alone with the papers, the process servers, and the ruins of her elaborate scheme. I drove away, not looking back at the house that represented 12 years of lies.
If this moment of justice gave you any satisfaction, the satisfaction of seeing the calculated strategist blindsided by their own victim, the Super Thanks button is right there. It helps me bring more of these stories to light. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic, exactly as Attorney Morrison had predicted. Jessica's attempt to mitigate the damage was futile. She tried to call her lawyer, Marcus, only to find he was already engaged in a defensive battle with Morrison, who had filed a temporary restraining order on several joint investment accounts. Alexander Thorne's involvement, which Jessica had hoped would be a secret, became the biggest liability. Thorne's PR team immediately tried to distance him, issuing a bland statement about misunderstandings regarding corporate travel arrangements, but the evidence was too explicit. The recordings, though legally obtained and admissible due to the context of fraud, were enough to make Thorne nervous about the public exposure and the potential for a scandal that could affect his company's stock value. He didn't offer Jessica protection. He cut her loose. Attorney Morrison successfully utilized the evidence of premeditated financial fraud and adultery to argue the case for fault. Jessica's carefully constructed 5-year plan to maximize alimony was completely dismantled. The court viewed the Chicago evidence not as simple infidelity, but as a calculated, long-term economic opportunism against a spouse. The final consequence was swift and absolute. The court awarded David a favorable settlement, minimizing my payout significantly and securing my financial stability. Jessica received only a fraction of what she had calculated, primarily her own separate assets. But the financial loss was secondary to the professional ruin. Jessica's reputation as a corporate consultant depended entirely on trust and discretion. When the details of the calculated betrayal, her use of a trillionaire for personal gain, her attempts to defraud her husband, leaked to her colleagues and her target clients, her career imploded. Major clients dropped her, citing unacceptable ethical risks. The calculated scheme designed to make her wealthy ended up costing her everything she had built professionally. She was forced to sell the house within 3 months to cover legal fees and establish her own life. The entire process, from that cold stairwell in Chicago to the final settlement documents, took 9 months. Every step was a battle, but because I had documentation, we were always ahead. The strategic approach had won. Everything about documentation, evidence gathering, and legal protection is covered in what I've pinned in the comments. Worth checking out if you're looking to protect yourself in a similar situation. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was living in a new apartment downtown. It was smaller than the house I shared with Jessica, but it was mine. I didn't have to walk on eggshells or pretend ignorance. I had genuine peace. The recovery wasn't just financial. It was mental. I had lost 20 pounds of stress weight, started exercising regularly, and focused entirely on my career, which flourished now that my energy wasn't tied up in maintaining a facade. I realized the moment I chose strategy over emotion outside that hotel room door in Chicago was the defining choice of my recovery. If I had confronted her then, I would have been destroyed emotionally and financially. Instead, I became a resilient survivor.
I reflected often on the betrayal. The cost was immense. 12 years of my life, my trust, and my emotional energy. But the lesson was priceless. I learned to trust my gut instinct and vet people not by their words, but by their actions and their financial movements. I learned that love, when corrupted by greed, becomes a business transaction, and you must treat it as such. I wrote a final, brief thank you note to Patricia Morrison, closing the professional chapter completely. She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. Her work had saved my life. I had gone from a loving, unsuspecting husband to a man who understood the cold calculus of betrayal and had successfully navigated the storm. Stories like this, of people who survived devastating betrayal and came out stronger, they matter.
If this one mattered to you, if it gave you any validation or clarity, a super thanks keeps them coming. The core lesson I carry forward is simple. Never confuse genuine love with a business transaction dressed up in sentimentality. Jessica saw our marriage as an investment vehicle, with the 5-year mark being the maturity date. When Alexander Thorne presented a higher return, she simply adjusted her portfolio. The key to my survival wasn't confrontation, anger, or despair. It was documentation. It was the calculated, unemotional gathering of evidence that proved her intent. When you face calculated deception, you must respond with calculated strategy. You must have the proof, the dates, the names, the numbers. Because evidence is the only thing that can stand up against a lie, no matter how powerful the liar or how deep their pockets. I took my life back.
I rebuilt my foundations not on blind trust, but on self-respect and the knowledge that I am capable of defending myself against even the most powerful, calculated betrayal. I look forward now, confident and secure, knowing that while I can't control what others do, I can absolutely control how I respond, and that I will never be an unsuspecting victim again. The journey continues, but the heavy weight of the past is finally gone.